Welcome to the second week of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. We have discussed the historical location of the idea of development within quote in the first week. Very quickly, if we have to recapitulate what we have discussed very quickly, we have discussed how sociology of development refers to the application of social theory and analysis to societies usually in the third world which are undergoing a late transition of capitalist industrialization. Sociology of development has been particularly concerned with analyzing the social effects of development on class relations and social groups such as the peasantry and the urban poor, and how development studies emerged as a distinct area of research in the post-Second World War period and was associated with a growing concern for the political and economic development of the post-colonial world. And the first sociological account of development was modernization theory. The modernization theory postulates that the less developed countries would eventually catch up with the industrialized world, provided they follow the economic and social systems of Western capitalism. And as we have discussed, the modernization theory is largely based on the theoretical premises of structural functionalism, I mean complementarity and reciprocity of roles in the social division of labor, creation and maintenance of structures and institutions of a capitalist society. The modernization theory conceptualized development as a staged transition from tradition to modernity to be brought about at the economic level by the operations of the market and foreign investment, at the social level by the adoption of appropriate Western institutions, values and behaviors, and at the political level by the implementation of parliamentary democracy. And how modernization theory was displaced by the dependency approach, and the dependency approach also was not without its limitations. And criticism of these approaches such as modernization theory and dependency theory has left the sociology of development as a much fragmented field in which various competing and more modest theories jostle for supremacy. And in recent years, there has been a growing awareness that the nation state cannot be analyzed in isolation from the international context. And then we have discussed how the field of sociology of development also has significant and growing overlaps with the sociological debates about globalization, environment, ecology, and sustainable development and so on. Okay. There has also been a renewed analytic emphasis on the interdependency and integration among nations, not just in terms of economic processes, but also at the level of culture and ideology. And how Lattus argues that the concept of third world development is rooted in specifically Western ideas of technical progress and the accumulation of capital that leads to development policies which destroy the cultures of non-Western populations. And in particular, Lattus maintains that the drive towards global uniformity in cultures, lifestyles and mentalities has been responsible for endemic civil wars, ecological disasters and the widespread national debt throughout the world by the creation of International Monetary Fund, by the creation of International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, popularly known as the World Bank, and so on. And then we shifted our attention to how development is fundamentally a process of change involving economic parameters, socio-cultural parameters, political parameters, physical structures, value systems, wage of life and so on. And how the process of development may be concerned with the turning of a wheel in which each segment pushes the one ahead of it and each in turn pushed by the other behind. And Nevertheless, it is not yet clear which segment should be manipulated to put the wheel in motion. Such an approach also implies that the process of development can be initiated through different sectors of the society. I mean, we have discussed the concept of development has subjective evaluative meaning as well as objective empirical meaning. The subjective evaluative perspective suggests that the concept of development can be viewed as a process of realizing certain goals or values such as improved health and housing, better nutrition, greater communication networks, improved transportation and increased command over resources. And objective empirical perspective suggests that more developed and less developed countries can be comparatively studied, and the empirical differences between them can be used to illustrate the meaning of development. And that is how we have discussed there are certain economic variables, I mean variations in per capita income, percentage of the population living in rural and urban areas, percentage of workers in primary, secondary and tertiary sectors, I mean agricultural, manufacturing and service sectors, the literacy rate and mortality and fertility rates. There are certain sociological variables that we have discussed, I mean in the form of division of labor or specialization, social differentiation, rationalization of values and modernization of outlook. And there are two very important political variables, namely mobilization and participation. Though there may be some degree of autonomy in the evaluative and objective characteristics of development, by and large there is a certain degree of coherence among them, implying an integral relationship between the various features of development. That is what we have discussed, how objective empirical characteristics have significant implications for subjective evaluative meanings. For example, when the per capita income of a country reaches a certain high level, a majority of the population would be living in urban areas and would be working in non-agricultural occupations. Social differentiation would be greater and the value orientation would be more rational. And similarly, subjective evaluative characteristics have significant implications for objective empirical meanings. I mean, for example, there would be also features like a high rate of literacy, low rates of mortality as well as fertility, more employment opportunities, greater satisfaction of basic needs and so on. That is how we have discussed how the idea of development in the sense of achieving an ever increasing level of income for the majority of the people in a country is relatively recent. That is how in many countries nationalism rather than human welfare played a more important role in pushing for development. Economic welfare and human welfare, I mean the way Pigou, Arthur Cecil Pigou, a neoclassical economist, the way he visualized. Okay? And our vantage point through which we are talking about, we are discussing development studies in general and sociology of development in particular. That is what we have already discussed, how the recent widespread concern with economic development may be traced to the Second World War, which necessitated a moral basis. The world was then gasping after being ravaged by the horrendous crimes and casualties perpetrated by the Second World War. National economies of most of the countries, both developed as well as developing countries, were in tatters and international trade touched the lowest ebb. And such was the situation that called for the reconstruction and development of poor as well as rich countries, and the freedom of the starving population from hunger in the Third World was also made its objective. And this focused the attention of several agencies and interest groups on the problems of development. Okay? And that is how we have discussed per capita income, structure of the economy and workforce, urbanization, saving rate, how saving rate leads to capital accumulation or capital formation. Then once capital gets accumulated, then how a country reaches the point of industrialization, and once a country is industrialized, then it leads to economic development. That is what. And how education became an important parameter of measuring development. And the United Nations Economic and Social Council, by dwelling upon welfare characteristics of development, tries to look at the social dimensions of development in terms of personal income, health, nutrition, education, housing and employment. Further, while dwelling upon welfare characteristics of development, the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development delineated different parameters of development, namely health, food and nutrition, education, conditions of work, employment situation, aggregate consumption and savings, transportation, housing, clothing, recreation and entertainment, social security and human freedom, human dignity and so on. Then we have discussed how realization of human potentiality again is an important indicator of development. That's how we quoted Dudley Sears when he said, to be chronically dependent upon another person even for food was incompatible with self-respect for a non-senile adult, especially for somebody who was preparing for an economically active life. That's how equity became a parameter of development. Okay? And then we have discussed physical quality of life index, how physical quality of life index has three parameters, namely life expectancy rate, infant mortality rate and literacy rate. Then we have discussed human development index. Human development index suggests that development is a process of enlarging people's choices, people's preferences. That's what was outlined by the United Nations Development Program in 1990. Development was conceptualized of having at least three parameters: a long and healthy life, expansion of knowledge, increase in resources for a decent standard of living. And sociological indicators we have discussed in the last week, how development affects the structure and character of societies in many ways. Transformation in the occupational structure and urbanization which occur with economic development are also indicators of sociological transformation in society. Comparative studies of more developed and less developed societies show significant differences in their mortality and fertility rates. And division of labor we have discussed, specialization, the evolution of universalistic values and norms is an important feature of developed societies. And then we have discussed political indicators of development, in the form of nation building, establishment of legal institutions, organization of political life, rationality in administration, secular ideologies and so on. And then we have discussed features of developing societies through the works of Liebenstein, Edelman and Morris, and then we have discussed low productivity, how backward economies are characterized by low productivity, primitive agriculture, limited use of capital, low use of inputs and also low level of consumption, low standard of living, poor hygiene, high fertility and high mortality rates, low human development, low investment in education, low demand for skills, hunger for land, the traditional non-agricultural sector, traditional markets. And then we have discussed sociological characteristics in the form of low level of differentiation, predominance of particularism, dualism, extended family, absence of a middle class, because that middle, why I am dealing with absence of a middle class, because of the intellectual and political consciousness, lack of social cohesion, traditional orientation, limited vision, lack of community consciousness and passivity. And among political characteristics, we have discussed integration of a population into a community, creation of a sense of national unity, emergence of specialized political structures having functionally distinct regulatory roles, and increase in governmental efficiency in utilizing the human and material resources of the polity for national goals. And developing countries such as India, they are fragmented on the basis of religion, caste, tribe, race, gender, ethnicity, language, region, insecurity and so on. And from here onward, from dwelling upon historical location of the idea of development within quote, we are going to discuss in this week in the form of 3 lectures. We are going to discuss end of colonialism, rise of nationalism in the third world, and the desire for development. Okay? Development within quote. Okay? We have tried to map out the contours of decolonization, underdevelopment, rise of nationalism in the third world, including India. Okay, when I said decolonization, rise of nationalism in the third world, I intend to draw your attention to Latin American countries, African countries, and Asian countries, and India is no exception to this. Okay, and the desire for development. Please don't think that no, Latin America, Africa, Asia, they are homogeneous categories. No, not at all. Okay, they are characterized by certain specific elements. Okay, even India and China, they are different countries. Okay, they should not be treated as homogeneous categories. They are pretty heterogeneous, right? I'm going to look at the development dictionary by Wolfgang Sachs, and then I'm going to dwell upon Gustavo Esteva in terms of the invention of underdevelopment, a metaphor and its contorted history. Contorted means distorted history, disordered history, colonizing anti-colonialism, conceptual inflation, expanding the reign of scarcity, new commons, and what is the call. We'll discuss these things. In saying development, nevertheless, most people are now saying the opposite of what they want to convey. Everyone gets confused. By using uncritically such a loaded word called development and one doomed to extinction, they are transforming its agony into a chronic condition. From the unburied corpse of development, every kind of pest has started to spread. The time has come to unveil the secret of development and see it in all its conceptual starkness. Okay? That is why we are trying to look at the background. Background in the form of decolonization, background in the form of rise of nationalism in the third world, and subsequently a desire to make development possible in the third world, in the colonized nations. That's why Esteva writes the invention of underdevelopment. At the end of the Second World War, the United States was a formidable and incessant productive machine, unprecedented in history, because of the kind of military acumen that they had possessed during and in the aftermath of the Second World War. It was indisputably at the center of the world, the United States of America. It was the master. All the institutions created in those years recognized that fact. Even the United Nations Charter echoed in the United States Constitution. The IMF, the World Bank, they were also creations of the US dictated directives. But the Americans wanted something more. They needed to make entirely explicit their new position in the world, and they wanted to consolidate that hegemony and make it permanent. For these purposes, they conceived a political campaign on a global scale that clearly bore their seal. Okay? They even conceived an appropriate emblem to identify that campaign, and they carefully chose the opportunity to launch both I mean on the 20th of January 1949, that very day, the day on which President Truman took office, a new era was opened for the world, the era of development, the age of development. We must, by using for the first time in such context the word underdeveloped. Okay, what President Truman, US President Truman, what he did, the word by using for the first time in such context the word underdeveloped, Truman changed the meaning of development and created the emblem, euphemism used ever since to allude either discreetly or inadvertently to the era of American hegemony. Never before had a word been universally accepted on the very day of its political coinage. A new perception of one's own self and of the other was suddenly created. 200 years of social construction of the historical political meaning of the term development were successfully asserted and transmogrified. A political and philosophical proposition of Karl Marx, packaged American style as a struggle against communism and at the service of the hegemonic design of the United States of America, succeeded in permeating both the popular and intellectual mind for the rest of the century. Underdevelopment began then on the 20th of January 1949, and on that day 2 billion people became underdeveloped. Okay? I mean in Asiatic nations, in African nations, in Latin American nations. In a real sense, from that time on, they ceased being what they were in all their diversity and were transformed into an inverted mirror of others' reality, a mirror that belittles them and sends them off to the end of the queue, a mirror that defines their identity, which is really that of a heterogeneous and diverse majority, simply in the terms of a homogenizing and narrow minority. Truman was not the first to use the word underdeveloped. Okay. Wilfred Benson, a former member of the Secretariat of the International Labour Organization (ILO), was probably the person who invented it, the term underdevelopment, undeveloped countries. Wilfred Benson, he referred to the underdeveloped areas while writing on the economic basis for peace in 1942. But the expression found no further echo neither with the public nor with the experts. 2 years later, in 1944, Roden continued to speak of economically backward areas. Arthur Lewis, also in 1944, referred to the gap between the rich and the poor nations. Throughout the decade, the expression appeared occasionally in technical books or United Nations documents, but it only acquired relevance when Truman presented it as the emblem of his own policy, and in this context it took on an unsuspected colonizing virulence. And since then, development within quote has connoted at least one thing: to escape from the undignified condition called underdevelopment. That's why when we say that the invention of underdevelopment, then perhaps human dignity has been compromised. When we say that this is an underdeveloped country, this is a developing country, then perhaps human freedom, human dignity, they are compromised. You look at the works of Tagore, you look at the works of Amartya Sen, you look at the works of Amit Bhaduri, you will find out that how human dignity very often is very often compromised in the underdeveloped countries. It does not imply that it has not been compromised in developed countries, but mostly you will find that human dignity, human freedom has been compromised, okay, in underdeveloped countries. Then development, whether be the political mobilization of people that we have discussed in the political indicators of development, okay, mobilization as well as participation, okay, that is why development be the political mobilization of a people for attaining their own objectives. It was sheer madness to pursue the goals that others had set. If some other country suggests that no, this is development, okay, foreign direct investment is development, it does not imply that Asiatic nations, African nations, Latin American nations, they must follow that. Okay. We must understand our own context to situate development. Okay. That is how Stavenhagen, Rodolfo Stavenhagen proposes today ethno-development or development with self-confidence, conscious that we need to look within and search for one's own culture instead of using a borrowed and foreign views, and suggests a development from the bottom up, conscious that all strategies based on a top-down design have failed to reach their explicitly stated objectives. That is why when you look at human dignity, human freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom to dissent, mobilization, participation, these are very important dimensions of development. Okay, that is what we are discussing in the context of decolonization and rise of nationalism. Okay, that is why I said, in fact, to make development possible, most of the countries they have tried to foreground the problematic of nationalism rather than human welfare. Okay, okay. Precisely because of the international political, military context, economic context, and so on. Okay. That is why when you talk about development, development must have a bottom up approach. It cannot have a top down approach. Okay. Okay. Then when I say participation, development must be participatory in nature. Okay? Development means participatory development. Okay? What? In order for someone to conceive the possibility of escaping from a particular condition, it is necessary first to feel that one has fallen into that condition. For those who make up 2/3 of the world's population today, okay, to think of development, of any kind of development, requires first the perception of themselves as underdeveloped with the whole burden of connotations that this carries. Okay. Today, for example, today for 2/3 of the people of the world, underdevelopment is a threat that has already been carried out, a life experience of subordination and of being led astray, of discrimination and subjugation. Given that precondition, the simple fact of associating with development one's own intention tends to annul the intention to contradict it, to enslave it. It impedes thinking of one's own objectives. It undermines confidence in oneself, one's own culture. It clamors for management from the top down, against which Jimmo, for example, rebelled. It converts participation into a manipulative trick to involve people in struggles for getting what the powerful want to impose on them. Okay? That is what was precisely what false Bourda or Rahman they wanted to avoid. Then in the first component, that the invention of underdevelopment, okay, as Estevaux argues that how once you consider that you are underdeveloped, it is not simply about economic underdevelopment, but at the level of culture as well as ideology. That is how your human freedom, human dignity has been compromised. Okay? Freedom to dissent has been compromised. That is how you become underdeveloped. Okay? Development occupies the center of an incredible powerful semantic constellation, a metaphor. Development has been used metaphorically today, okay, and its distorted history, contorted history. Disordered history. Okay, there is nothing in modern mentality comparable to it as a force guiding thought and behavior. At the same time, very few words are as feeble, as fragile, and as incapable of giving substance and meaning to thought and behavior as this one. In common parlance, development describes a process through which the potentialities of an object or organism are released until it reaches its natural, complete, full-fledged form. Hence, the metaphoric use of the term, okay, to explain the natural growth of plants and animals. Through this metaphor, it became possible to show the goal of development and much later its program, its policy for the development of whole of society. The development or evolution of living beings in biology, for example, referred to the process through which organisms achieved their genetic potential, the natural form of being pre-seen by the biologist. Development was frustrated whenever the plant or the animal failed to fulfill its genetic program or substituted for it another. In such cases of failure, its growth was not development, but rather an anomaly. Okay? Anomaly. Anomaly refers to unanticipated or unexpected occurrences or happenings. Anomalies refer to this, okay, which we have not anticipated, which we have not expected. Okay. Maybe the such anomalies may be like pathological or even anti-natural behavior. The study of these monsters became critical for the formulation of the first biological theories. It was between 1759 by Wolff and then later on in 1859 by Charles Darwin, principle of natural selection, the origin of species, evolution of species, and so that development evolved from a conception of transformation that moves towards the appropriate form of being to a conception of transformation that moves towards an ever to more perfect form. During this period, evolution and development began to be used as interchangeable terms by scientists, whether it is evolution or development. Okay? Initially, they were used interchangeably. The transfer of the biological metaphor, what is a metaphor, by the way? I mean, what is a metaphor? Metaphor is that where you will find two dissimilar things and we try to bring about, or we are trying to foreground similar activity of two dissimilar things. If I say Sachin Tendulkar runs like a hare, because he runs very fast, but Sachin Tendulkar is not a hare, right? It is not a deer, right? But they are two dissimilar things, but they run very fast, right? In this sense, okay. That is why the transfer of the biological metaphor to the social sphere, that when I said development and development development and evolution, initially they were used interchangeably by scientists, especially biologists. Okay? And such transfer of the biological metaphor to the social sphere occurred in the last quarter of the 18th century. Okay? Justus Moser, the conservative founder of social history, from 1768 used the word Entwicklung to allude to the gradual process of social change. When he talked about the transformation of some political situations, he described them almost as natural processes. In 1774, Herder started to publish his interpretation of universal history, in which he presented global correlations by comparing the ages of life with social history. But he went beyond this comparison, applying to his elaborations the organological notion of development coined in the scientific discussions of his time. He frequently used the image of the germ to describe the development of organizational forms. By the end of the century, based on the biological scale of Bonnet, he tried to combine the theory of nature with the philosophy and history in an attempt to create a systematic and consistent unity. Historical development thus was the continuation of natural development according to him, and both were just variants of the homogeneous development of the cosmos. Okay? Towards 1800, that term that Herder pointed out, that Entwicklung began to appear as a reflexive word. Self-development became fashionable. That's all supernatural forces started to disappear in the popular conception of the universe. Okay? And a few decades later, all possibilities were open to the human subject, author of his own development, emancipated from the divine design. Development became the central category of Marx's work, revealed as a historical process that unfolds with the same necessary character of natural laws. Okay? Both the Hegelian concept of history and the Darwinist concept of evolution were interwoven in development, reinforced with the scientific aura of Karl Marx. When the metaphor returned to the vernacular, it acquired a violent colonizing power. Soon employed by the politicians, it converted history into a program, a necessary and inevitable destiny. The industrial mode of production, which was no more than one among many forms of life, became the definition of the terminal stage of a unilinear way of social evolution. This stage came to be seen as the natural culmination of the potentials already existing in Neolithic individual as his or her logical evolution. Thus, history was reformulated in Western terms. That is how we will find colonial hegemony on the rest of the population. The metaphor of development gave global hegemony to a purely Western genealogy of history. Okay? Robbing peoples of different cultures of the opportunity to define the forms of their social life. The vernacular sequence, development is possible after envelopment was inverted with the transfer. Scientific lodge took the place of God in the enveloping function, defining the program. Marx, for example, rescued a feasible initiative based on the knowledge of those laws. Truman took over this perception, but transferred the role of prime mover, the primum movens condition from the communists and the proletariat to the experts and to capital, thus ironically following the precedent set by Lenin and thereafter Stalin. The debris of metaphors used throughout the 18th century began to become a part of ordinary language in the 19th century, with the word development accumulating in it a whole variety of connotations. This overload of meanings ended up dissolving its precise significance. The Encyclopedia of all systems of teaching and education was published in Germany in 1860. Its entry on development indicated that this concept is applied to almost all that human beings have and know. The world Icahn said in 1878, the world has become almost useless for science except in certain areas. Okay? How scientific laws, how colonialism, how scientific laws tried to object colonialism, challenge colonialism. Okay? Between 1875 and 1900, there were published in English books whose titles alluded to the development of the Athenian constitution, the English novel The Transportation System in the United States, Marriage, Parenting and so on. Some authors preferred still evolution in the title of their books, studying the thermometer or the idea of God. Others preferred growth in the title, but even they used development in the text as the principal operating term. By the beginning of the 20th century, a new use of the term became widespread, that is called urban development. Okay? Very often we talk about development in the context of urbanization, urban development. That has stood since then for a specific manner of reformulation of urban surroundings based on the bulldozer and the massive homogeneous industrial production of urban spaces and specialized installations. But this specific use and anticipation of what Truman said, underdevelopment, in 1949, US President Truman said, did not succeed in establishing the generalized image that is now associated with the word. In the third decade in the 1930s, 1940s or so, the association between development and colonialism established a century ago acquired a different meaning. When the British government transformed its law of development of the colonies into the law of development and welfare of the colonies in 1939, this reflected the profound economic and political mutation produced in less than a decade. To give the philosophy of the colonial masters a positive meaning, the British argued for the need to guarantee the natives minimum levels of nutrition, health and education. A dual mandate started to be sketched. The conqueror should be capable of economically developing the conquered region and at the same time accepting the responsibility of caring for the well-being of the natives. After the identification of the level of civilization with the level of production, the dual mandate collapsed into one that is called development within quote. Throughout the 20th century, okay, even after the Second World War, even after most of the countries became politically independent and so on, throughout the 20th century, the meanings associated with urban development and colonial development conquered with many others or transformed many others to transform the word development step by step into one with contours that are about as precise as those of an amoeba. It is now a mere algorithm whose significance depends on the context in which it is employed. It may allude to a housing project, to the logical sequence of a thought, to the awakening of a child's mind, to a chess game or to the budding of a teenager's breasts. But even though it lacks on its own any precise denotation, it is firmly seated in popular and intellectual perception. And it always appears as an evocation of a net of significances in which the person who uses it is irremediably trapped. Development cannot de-link itself from the words with which it was formed, maybe growth, maybe evolution, maybe maturation and so on. Just the same, those who use the word cannot free themselves from a web of meanings that impart a specific blindness to their language, thought and action. No matter the context in which it is used or the precise connotation that the person using it wants to give it, the expression becomes qualified and colored by meanings perhaps unwanted. The word development always implies a favorable change, a step from the simple to the complex, from the inferior to the superior, from worse to better. The word development indicates that one is doing well because one is advancing in the sense of a necessary universal law toward a desirable goal. The word development retains to this day the meaning given to it a century ago by the creator of ecology, Haeckel. That's how Haeckel suggests that development is from this moment on the magic word with which it will solve all the mysteries that surround us, or at least that which will guide us towards their solution. But for 2/3 of the population on this planet, this positive meaning of the word development, profoundly rooted after 2 centuries of its social construction, is a reminder of what they are not. It is a reminder of an undesirable, undignified condition, and to escape from it, they need to be enslaved to others' experiences and dreams. And therein lies the significance of colonizing anti-colonialism. In that speech by Truman, the US President Truman in 1949, there was no room for technical or theoretical precision. The emblem defines a program conscious of Mao Zedong's arrival in the People's Republic of China looking for evolution as an antidote for revolution in the herder tradition, while simultaneously adapting the revolutionary impetus with which Marx endowed the word. The Truman design sometimes uses development in the transitive sense of the British colonial administrators in order to clearly establish the hierarchy of initiatives that it promotes. But it can also pass without difficulty in the intransitive use of the term in the finest Hegelian tradition, as it was taken for granted that underdevelopment itself was out there, that it was something real, explanations of the phenomenon began to appear. Why a country is underdeveloped? Why a country is developed? We must provide some explanation. That's why colonialism, studying colonialism is important. Okay. An intense search for its material and historical causes immediately started. Some, like Hirschman, A.O. Hirschman, an economist, gave no importance to the gestation period. Okay. Others, on the contrary, made this aspect the central element of their elaborations and described in painstaking detail colonial exploitation in all its variations and the processes of primitive accumulation of capital. Pragmatic attention also began to be given to the internal or external factors that seem to be the current cause of underdevelopment, I mean terms of trade, unequal exchange, dependency, protectionism, imperfections of the market, corruption, lack of democracy or entrepreneurship, and so many. If you when I said terms of trade, if countries like India, they are engaged in international trade, and if the terms of trade favor the already developed nations, then we will be unfavorably affected, we will be adversely affected, right. That is why not simply international trade, but also unequal exchange, dependency. I mean, if countries like India will only supply cheap labor force and raw materials to the developed countries, and in turn only and in turn the developed countries will only supply the finished goods, then we will be perennially dependent on those developed countries. We cannot have technological base and so on. Okay. Protectionism, imperfections of the market, corruption, lack of democracy, entrepreneurs. For example, in Latin America, the Peace Corps, the Point 4 program, the War on Poverty, and the Alliance for Progress contributed to root the notion of underdevelopment in popular perception and to deepen the disability created by such perception. But none of these campaigns are comparable to what was achieved in the same sense by Latin American dependency theorists and other leftist intellectuals dedicated to criticizing all and every one of the development strategies that the North Americans successively put into fashion. For them, as for many others, Truman had simply substituted a new word for what had already been there, backwardness or poverty. According to them, the backward or poor countries were in that condition due to past lootings in the process of colonization and the continued raping by capitalist exploitation at the national and international levels. Underdevelopment was the creation of development. Then underdevelopment became the creation of development, I mean creation of colonialism, creation of the century long exploitation the colonizers on the colonized nations. Okay. However, Esteva suggests that by adapting in an uncritical manner the view to which they meant to be opposed, their efficient criticism of the ambiguity and hypocrisy of the Western promoters of development gave a virulent character to the colonizing force of the metaphor. How to ignore when Marx said once, the indubitable fact that India is bound to the English yoke precisely by an Indian army supported by India. That is what when Marx was writing the first Indian War of Independence, I mean 1857, he wrote that how even if India is inferior in terms of modes of production and so on, as compared to the British, how whichever way the British try to colonize a great nation like India, but it cannot keep on colonizing countries like India, because it will become an unconscious tool of history in bringing about that revolution. Okay? Okay. In this sense, the very discussion of the origin or current issues of underdevelopment illustrates to what extent it is admitted to be something real, concrete, quantifiable and identifiable, a phenomenon whose origin and modalities can be the subject of investigation. The word defines, the word development defines a perception. This becomes in turn an object, a fact. Okay? No one seems to doubt that the concept does not allude to real phenomena. They do not realize that it is a comparative adjective whose base of support is the assumption, very Western but unacceptable and undemonstrable, of the oneness, homogeneity and linear evolution of the world. It displays a falsification of reality produced through dismembering the totality of interconnected processes that make up the world's reality, and in its place it substitutes one of its fragments isolated from the rest as a general point of reference. Okay? This is very important. Then in the what we have discussed in this lecture, we have discussed a part of, or you may say 1/3 of end of colonialism, rise of nationalism in the third world, and the desire for development in the form of Esteva's reflections on the invention of underdevelopment, how development has been used as a metaphor and its distorted history, its contorted history. Okay? And then we have discussed colonizing, anti-colonialism and so on. Okay? Then in the next lecture, what we are going to do, in the next 2 lectures, what we are going to do, we are going to discuss conceptual inflation, expanding the reign of scarcity, new commons, and what is the call, or what should be the call in a more normative sense. Okay? And then we will discuss ideologies of Western dominance as well as ideologies of modernization, decolonization, the Cold War between the capitalist and the socialist nations, and nation building from 1945 to 1960. Then how there was a rise of Asian studies, emergence of Southeast Asian studies and so on. I'll be looking at the works of Berger and so on, and decolonization and the Cold War and nation building from 1960 to 1975, and then military modernization theory and nation building. We will be discussing these over a period of 2 more lectures on this topic, end of colonialism, rise of nationalism in the third world, and to desire and the desire to make development possible in the third world, and India is no exception to this. That's how we will be ending the week with these 3 lectures. Then we have completed 1/3 of this debate on decolonization, nationalism in the third world, and the desire for development, and the 2/3 we are in the next 2 lectures we are going to cover. Thank you.